Of the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission to order. We'll start off tonight with the citizens forum. Does anyone have any questions or comments that aren't on the agenda?
See where the audience was.
Yeah. They're home watching the football game.
Oh,
If anybody has any questions or comments about anything that's not on the agenda, we'll take it at this time. Or anybody on the Planning Commission or Mark have anything?
Just send out a reminder on a training opportunity. Some of y'all still need to fulfill your 4 hours before the end of the year, so you might want to think about on November 29th. There's 2 different training sessions dealing with understanding the true cost of development. The first one's at 2:30, and that's at the Chancellor YMCA. You need to register for that or sign up for it. It's free. I think I sent you all the email. Just let them know if you want to go. That one's more geared toward planners and engineers and planning commissioners. Then there's one at 5:30 at the Knox County Health Department. And it's the same presentation, but it's more geared toward the general public. But either one would be fine and would count toward your 4 hours of continuing education, and they're both about
Health Department downtown or health
Knox County Health Department, and that one, let's see, I think they're, but yeah, it's the downtown.
Okay.
That was probably in that email, but if anybody's got any questions, they can let me know and I can get it to you. The Chancellor YMCA is at 616 Jessamine Street, Knoxville. I'm not sure where that is.
Okay. Do planning commissioners need to contact you or Ashley to find out whether they're short or not?
Register online.
Yeah, we've got a record of it.
Okay. If anybody has questioned whether or not they have the amount of training that we need for this year, be good to contact them, make sure. We're almost running out of a year. So, and they can let you know.
How many hours do we have to have?
4. Some of you have way more than that, I think. Some may not.
About 1/10 of what we got.
well, I think the one session we had down at the UT Training Center,
That might have been 4.
that
Yeah,
was-
on the floodplain.
I think
that was probably 4
by
I think.
itself, at least, wasn't
Yeah, and that definitely counted.
Okay.
it? Betty was at that.
Anybody else, questions or comments? In that case, we'll move on to the approval of the agenda.
Items 4 and 5 have been requested by the applicant for postponement.
I'd move for approval of the agenda with the postponement of items 4 and 5.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Approval of the minutes from the October 20th, 2016 meeting.
Motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so item number 6, discussion and public hearing on a text amendment to the Farragut zoning ordinance, Chapter 3, Section 12, General Commercial C-1, subsection B-12, to amend the provisions to allow for outdoor kennel facilities, dog care, canine, play school applicant.
This item we talked about last month. It's a workshop discussion, and we talked about the existing provisions that relate to kennels in our zoning ordinance. They don't currently provide for outdoor fenced area. A kennel is defined in Chapter 2 of the zoning ordinance as any lot or premises on which 4 or more dogs more than 6 months of age are kept. And currently there's a couple of development-related criteria for kennels to be allowed in the general commercial district. The building has to be soundproofed. There's no specific parameters that are in the ordinance currently for that, how you determine that. But there is a requirement that a certification verifying the soundproofing be provided with the site plan for this type of use. And then secondly, that there is no outdoor fencing permitted. The applicant petitioned the board for the ability to have an outdoor fenced area, and they have an existing facility that predates this current requirement, and they're moving from that facility to another location. They have an outdoor area at their existing facility, and would like to be able to have that at their new facility. And so that's what their request primarily involves. The current criteria that we have in the zoning ordinance really, from a staff's perspective, appears to be addressing, preventing these uses from becoming a nuisance potentially to abutting properties. You can have a situation, obviously, where they could be noisy and potentially smelly or unsightly, and that's probably why the outdoor fencing is not currently permitted. When we brought up the outdoor fencing question last month, it did seem like there was a general reception to that being allowed. We had some people speak out that were concerned about having dogs outside the commercial property to the west, the Surgoonies Golf, and then some residents from Stonecrest were concerned about mainly the noise, I believe. And you asked the staff to try to work on some language, which at that time I told you it may or may not be ready for consideration, but it may still not be. But we did put together some parameters in Ordinance 1625 that does provide for outdoor fences, and it gives a number of specific requirements related to that, and it also establishes some other provisions designed to minimize any potential adverse impacts from this type of use. We added specific noise-based parameters that, since I didn't really know anything about decibel readings, I based it largely on the sound analysis that a registered engineer provided for the space that the applicant's looking at moving into. So that we do have very specific parameters rather than our current language, which is pretty open-ended. And then, added a number of other very specific stipulations in there related to kennels. One thing to bring up, just as a point of discussion, in the town zoning ordinance, we have some uses that could, in some situations, be considered a nuisance that are allowed only as a special exception. And that's something to think about with a kennel, particularly if you have outdoor fencing, as to whether we would want to provide for these in general commercial, but first they would have to be considered as part of a special exception review by the Board of Zoning Appeals. And what the board would be looking at would be really whether the use, first of all, of course, it would have to meet the language that we're proposing in this ordinance, but then also they would look at the surrounding plan of development and whether that would fit in with what's around that particular proposed use. So it would give the community, potential affected residents, more public engagement. They'd be able to come to the Board of Zoning Appeals and talk about why they do or do not think a kennel would be appropriate in that particular location. The board would also look at the future land use map and those kinds of things for guidance. But, that's just something to think about, whether this particular type of use would necessitate that additional layer of review. Or if you're comfortable with the parameters in the ordinance itself, as long as an applicant can meet those parameters, if that would be sufficient. or if you want to discuss any of these parameters or have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer anything that you may have. And I know Ms. Williams is here if you have any specific questions related to her type of use.
I do have a question. Does this go before the VRB?
It does not go before the VRB, no.
So it's possible there'd be no landscaping or anything around it?
We do not have that in the in this ordinance as it's currently worded, although that certainly could be an additional parameter. Yeah. I thought a little bit about that actually, and requiring some kind of buffering. Then I was kind of wondering how much of along the property line would you buffer? You know, it's a little bit. I wouldn't expect somebody occupying a lease space to come in and provide a full buffer strip, you know, along a property line. But you could certainly require some specific amounts of plant material associated with outdoor areas, and that could also help with noise potentially.
One thing we need to remember is we're not talking about just this one particular
right.
business and space.
Right.
The only other question I had was, should there be a minimum size? You know, I don't know how big these facilities are. Perhaps,
We need you to go up to the,
Yeah, you'll have to come up. Well, I've got a maximum.
I think we have a maximum of 25% of the inside space. So I don't think we necessarily talked about a
Didn't
minimum
provide a minimum.
size.
Right,
though
that's
it's
right.
not in there. I don't know what the usual size of a facility such as yours is.
It's usually
we need to, who you are and give us an address.
Harriet Williams, and it's 101 North Campbell Station Road, Farragut. Dog Days Canine Play School. I mean, they usually are between 2,500 and 5,000 square feet. Most of the ones that are 5,000 square feet are usually located in a more rural area.
Okay. So they're not likely to be very small, such as the size of this room.
No, probably bigger. I mean, there are some. I've seen some that are 1,500 square feet in a strip mall before. But I think he had put in there what the fence would be 1/4 of the
1/4 of
size.
the indoor, yeah,
No larger than.
yeah.
So that would be, like, if my place is 2,500 square feet, it would be 625 square feet. And right now, where I'm at, that building's 5,000 square feet, but I use probably 2,500 of it, and I think the fence is 450 to 500 square feet right now, the fence I have.
I think the requirements that we have as written, i.e. the outdoor structures and fences associated with kennels shall not be visible from public streets, and 150-foot setback from residential or agricultural zoning. And I think we've addressed this, that I feel real comfortable approving it as it's written, without any additional special exception type of restrictions.
I have one comment relative to the wording on G.
Okay.
I think to just make it patently clear that we're talking about an increment of 30 decibels outside the facility. We use the same language I think we saw in the engineer's letter saying, and yielding 30 decibels outside the facility.
And yielding
Yeah,
30 okay.
just to make it very clear that we're not going to take a reading out there and it's 30 or 40 and it's not because of the dogs, for instance.
Right. And you're going to have 30 out there today just with traffic.
How other people might read it.
Well, I think that, you know, the decibel level that they're got proposing it not exceed is pretty low. If you walk down Kingston Pike very often, you'll know that it's loud. And it's less, this is far less than that.
Oh, yeah.
So
I think what Ed St. Clair is saying is that what we're looking at is the,
I just want somebody taking a decibel measurement outside and then say, well, it's 40 or 50, but there's no dogs in the facility.
right, that's exactly right.
It's to be just I just want to make it very, very
You're,
clear.
but basically, we're looking for a difference of a baseline increase of no more than 30 decibels before and after. And I think that's what is,
That's the way it was worded in the engineer's letter.
and we're just trying to figure out a way to adjust the language in G. Is that what you're thinking, Ed?
Yeah, and just say.
To make it a little clearer?
Yeah, and just say, and yielding 30 decibels outside the facility.
And yielding no more than 30?
Yeah.
Would that be yielding no more than 30
Correct. That's fine.
decibels outside the facility? What about the inside? Is that
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what, I mean,
from exceeding 80 decibels inside?
it seems to be consistent with the logic I saw in the engineer's letter.
Well, I guess it would probably be then from yielding.
Very quiet.
Yielding no more than 80 decibels inside the facility.
Well, you've got a base
and-
there of exceeding. I mean, you're inside the facility.
Yeah.
You know,
Which
you've
is
got the
supposed to be
source there.
soundproof.
You've got the source there, and you have the soundproofing. And
Yeah.
the soundproofing is supposed to yield
That's right.
a certain outside decibel level.
So that part would be fine as written then, I guess.
Right.
Okay. Else have anything? Anybody want any language dealing with landscaping related to this?
Well, if a new facility comes in, would it go before landscaping would be considered in it, right?
Well, they'll have it. Yeah. I mean,
It was a new
it'd be-
ground-up facility.
Yeah, it'd be part of the overall plan. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I was really kind of thinking about the tree close to shade, the pad, or particularly if it's concrete, because it gets pretty hot in the summertime.
That's a good thought, because I thought about landscaping too. I didn't know exactly. I was trying to keep it, I guess. I didn't put it in there just to leave it a little flexible for a retrofit. But we could add some language if you want.
The only problem I was thinking is if you're doing it like I would be doing it, I'm going to be in a parking lot, so it's all going to be asphalt. So it's going to be a little, like if you put the fence up and then try to then it's going to go further into like where the traffic would go around the building. And it'd be kind of hard to dig, to put trees or plants in the asphalt on the other side of the fence. Because there is some landscaping on the inside that's already there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think most of the kennel places would be probably using either a parking lot or some kind of concrete area. So that
Most of them have a hard floor on the kennel, so they don't most of them don't ever have any.
Well, now, are we talking right at the facility, or are we talking at the property line?
I think we're talking more to screen the fence is what it sounds like we're talking about right here, aren't we?
I was more interested in shading it for the dogs.
Yeah, I think she was talking about interior probably. I don't know how that would work,
Go outside when they're in the,
or a combination
area.
thereof.
Well, I'm very happy to see the language about the supervision in there. To me, the on-site supervision was critical for me to get comfortable with this, to keep it from being an old-time kennel where the dogs are just out there and barking.
Yeah.
And to me, it's real black and white to walk by, and or drive by and
Yeah.
you see a bunch of dogs out there and there's no supervision, then that's a violation.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think if you do have some problem dogs that do a lot of yapping, you're going to have some supervision out there to be able to hopefully mitigate that somehow.
Yeah, we were trying to kind of be clear that it's just an area to take them out temporarily with direct supervision and bring them back in. It's not a place just to leave the dogs out there, unmanaged for long periods of time. 'Cause
Right.
that's not what we wanted.
For any period of time unmanaged.
Right. She'll still have to present a site plan to you all, that if this ordinance passes. So we'll have to have where this is going on the site and make sure it doesn't conflict with traffic flow or take up any required parking, make sure they have enough parking and it's not consuming any required spaces, that they still have enough and meet their parking space requirements and those kinds of things. And then, dealing with the stormwater issue, it'll have to be constructed so it'll drain to the sanitary sewer, and that'll have to be shown as part of the plans.
Not with this facility, but again, if any facility comes anywhere else within the zoning, have we given the surrounding tenants or the surrounding homes enough protection?
Tried to do that with the distance, the setbacks, and then the noise, the specific parameters on the decibel readings, but and then having quite a few conditions related to the fence itself. What style, height it needs to be, the appearance of it, so it's not a big pink fence or something. That.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's kind of new territory for me dealing with this use, so we tried to look at some other communities and pull from their provisions. And actually, probably if this is adopted, this is probably the most, that I've found at least, most detailed provisions that you'll find dealing with kennels, at least that I'm aware of. I'm sure there probably are more detailed ones out there, but it's pretty specific and should be pretty objective. I don't think there's a lot of subjectivity in this.
No, I'm fine with it.
Any more questions or comments? Are we to vote tonight, or do you need?
If you're comfortable, it is presented for a vote. It would be a recommendation for approval of resolution PC-16-18 with the language adjustment recommended by Commissioner St. Clair.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Seconded that, I'm sorry.
Betty?
Betty. So this will go to the Board of Mayor and Alderman next, just so you know.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
Do you
you.
have
If
a
you need
date on
anything else
that?
from me, let me know.
Do you have a date on that yet for her, or?
It would be, what is that,
Number 15 is probably.
it's the second Thursday in December is probably be the next. I think that is right, December 8th. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Item number 7, discussion on request for a text amendment to the Farragut zoning ordinance, Chapter 4, Section 3, antennas and towers, to provide for new telecommunication provisions.
This is just moving this item along a little bit further. We talked last month, we had a workshop conducted by Larry Perry on really new legal requirements and the latest technologies dealing with telecommunications. And we feel that it's very likely that especially with the 5G technology that's on the horizon, that we're going to probably be faced with a pretty significant number of requests for some kind of additional telecommunication structures in the town. So what we're trying to do, and it's on our department's work program, is to update our telecommunication provisions as best we can to bring them in line with legal requirements and the latest technologies, even though that's constantly evolving. We currently have 2 sections in our zoning ordinance that deal with telecommunications. We have in Chapter 3, which is our zoning districts chapter, we've got the telecommunications tower overlay. And historically what we've required, and this is for the big tall monopole commercial towers like the new one on Concord Road. If somebody wants to put one of those up in the town, they have to request a rezoning for telecommunications overlay. If it's on property that's zoned residential, then they also have to request a rezoning to change the base zoning on the property. That's what we did on Concord Road. If you remember, that property was zoned residential. So they had to change it to commercial and then also provide for the tower overlay. So that process, as you know, rezoning process is 3 to 4 months. That one for that particular project was probably longer than that because we had, I don't know how many workshops on that, but they were very good applicant, good to work with, so the timing wasn't really ever brought up. The second portion of our zoning ordinance that deals with telecommunications is in Chapter 4, and that's in the antennas and towers section, and that's a kind of an outdated section. It talks about dish antenna, which we don't really see that much anymore other than the small ones on houses, but talks about amateur radio towers. Again, they're not very common, but it does not really specifically address the monopole towers. That's pretty much handled entirely in Chapter 3. So what Larry Perry was asked to do was to take our existing provisions and work on a draft of what he would recommend as updates. And he did that, and we, the staff, reviewed that and gave him some comments and had a number of questions even after our initial review. I think I had emailed you those questions, and then I also, a couple days ago, received Larry's response to my questions, and I emailed you those. And basically what I'd like to do is just very briefly go through some of these questions that I think are very critical and get your all's feedback. What Larry recommended was, once I got some feedback from you all, was to take his responses and then the staff finalize the draft and then send that out to telecommunications providers and get their input, like Mary Miller that came here with Crown Castle. She's a lawyer. I mean, she could give us some, if she wants to, she can give us some feedback on that. And that way, you know, someone couldn't come in after we've adopted these provisions and say, well, we didn't know about it, we didn't have an opportunity to provide input. It doesn't mean that we have to take in all their recommendations, but at least they do have an opportunity to look at it, and hopefully they would come up with some suggestions that will make the provisions even better and more in line with how these things actually work in the real world. So first question that I'd asked Larry was dealing with the tower overlay and whether that's something that we needed to revisit in light of the 2015 court ruling that essentially when an application is complete and submitted, you have 60 days to provide an answer. Now that when an application becomes complete is up to the staff as worded in his draft ordinance, and we would indicate to an applicant when we consider an application complete. For example, in the case of the ZAO request that came here a few months ago, their application is still not complete because they involve, their request involves the use of public poles, and that requires a lease agreement, and the town is still working with them on developing the lease agreement. So until we get further along with, for example, that aspect of their request, it's not considered a complete application.
Would that apply to most everybody, or once we get a lease agreement, would that be kind of the standard lease agreement, or does that have to vary from?
We're hoping that
application.
that lease agreement will have a lot of language that we can use on subsequent requests. I mean, that would be ideal. Of course, the technology is constantly changing, and somebody may be proposing something very different in another location that that lease agreement wouldn't cover or be relevant to. But that's something to keep in mind, is that 60-day shot clock, if you will, doesn't start until the town feels that the application is complete. With a freestanding tower like the one on Concord Road, it doesn't involve public property. So, that one is a little tighter as far as turnaround. And Larry didn't feel that the rezoning process would really, in most cases, fit in with the 60-day time frame. So we probably do need to revisit that. We probably will recommend just deleting that section from Chapter 3, and we'll just provide clear standards in Chapter 4 that deal with the large towers and also the small cells. I don't know how you all feel about that, or if you have an opinion one way or the other, but his thought was if we were to get challenged on that with the rezoning process because of its length, that we could have an issue. Something else that I'd asked him about was whether we could prohibit the large towers in our mixed-use town center. And I personally talked to him about this the other day, and he felt like because that area is much smaller than the residential area in the town, that we could prohibit those tall towers in our mixed-use town center. Now, small cells and things like that, we need to probably try to provide for, and you can maybe do that actually on buildings, or do some non-structure type applications within buildings. That might be possible, since you've got taller buildings and buildings that would be closer to the street. So that one we should be able to keep in there. I asked him about whether we could prohibit small cell DAS on property zoned residential, and this could come into play with the 5G technology. Remember, Larry was talking about we could have a situation where you might need some kind of a pole or antenna structure in very frequent locations, even in residential areas. His thought was we can't prohibit those in residential. We can certainly provide very strict parameters, with stealth technology, and we can require things underground, maybe even some antenna concealment techniques, like some of the taping around the antennas. But we're going to have to figure out how to allow for those small cell structures in residential areas. And one thing we might want to think about is amending our subdivision regulations for when somebody puts in a new subdivision, and just go ahead and accept the fact that we're going to have this technology in our developments, and try to find a place centralized within the development where you could actually go ahead and put up a 35-foot pole with conduit available to it, so that people, when they come in to buy lots in the development, they already know the pole's there. It's not going to be a surprise. It's kind of like walking trails. We require the walking trails to be paved and put in before we final out a subdivision. That way somebody doesn't buy a lot and then the town comes in and builds a trail right beside their property line. They didn't know anything about it. So that's kind of a revolutionary idea in a way. You'd have to work with providers, and that's part of what I think they could give us some input on if we sent this to them. And also developers. We'd have to work with developers on who's going to pay for that, how's that going to happen, how are you going to coordinate that. You have to provide the pole somewhere where conduit could be, available. You wouldn't want it out in the middle of nowhere in an open space lot, where you'd have to extend the conduit hundreds of feet. So those are things to think about, that we could be very proactive. The risk with that is that it's possible that the technology could change and we may not even need freestanding poles. You just never know. There's a kind of a gray area out there. The feeling right now is that there's going to be a need for more freestanding structures. Larry did feel that we could restrict those to 35 feet, which is the maximum height in residential. Although he felt like having them up to 50 feet would provide for better coverage. So that's something to think about. I don't know if y'all have any. I'm throwing a lot of information out to you. Do y'all have any thoughts or questions so far on what I've mentioned?
How tall are the light poles around a pool, say for instance, or in a subdivision?
Yeah, light poles can be up to 26 feet tall. So they would be, as envisioned, they would be about almost 10 feet taller than that, assuming the light poles are at their maximum height.
50 foot would really stand out.
Yeah, 50 foot would almost stand out like a small monopole tower.
Yeah, like a pine tree.
Yeah. And, residential street lights poles are only 14 feet tall, so it'd be a whole lot taller than them. But you clearly couldn't put it on something that's 14 feet. Now, we could require and set up on the front end of new subdivisions the underground, requirement for everything, but you still got the question of, you still have to have a pole for the antenna, at least based on current technology.
So are we talking one pole per subdivision, or are we talking?
Yeah, he didn't know, and that's another thing that is kind of is a little bit of a gray area. I guess it would depend on how big the subdivision is. Yeah, so that's something I don't know if we really know enough about what the future could hold to build that into our subdivision regulations. I'm always a big proponent of planning ahead for things, rather than having to retrofit something after the fact. But this is an area where the technology is so in flux that I'd hate to have subdivisions come in and put up these poles and then they not be necessary on the other hand, So it's a little tricky. Maybe we can certainly work with developers to lay the conduit in, because I don't think that's going to change. You're going to have fiber to these things, and then allocate the space for undergrounding the structures. I think you could do that. But how we deal with the antennas is, I'm not really sure what to recommend on that. And maybe that's something the carriers can give us some input on.
Well, Mark, I guess what our real goal is that the FCC is kind of mandated maximum wireless coverage in their regulations, and what we're looking at is basically conforming with that regulation at the same time making it aesthetically nice.
Yeah.
If you don't have if you don't have the wireless wireless, you end up with having only wired internet, internet, for lack of a better term, but so, and today, every one of us is carrying a smartphone that's highly dependent upon wireless.
Yep.
So,
And as Larry said at the training session, his thought was it's considered a utility, and it's something that probably legally a community has to provide for.
A couple of questions on if you designate an area for a pole, should you need a pole? At least that gives the new homeowner an idea of, I'm going to be living beside a pole if I buy this lot.
Yeah. You may do a pole easement
Yeah,
to where it actually is physically platted.
yeah.
Yeah. That's another way to do it. Yeah.
I would want to know if I was buying by a
Right.
pole.
Right. Here's what could happen
Yeah,
here,
right.
depending on whether
Right.
it's needed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second thing is, you were talking about who pays for it. So if I develop my neighborhood and don't put in a pole, then who pays for it when one is needed? Do you have any idea?
The carrier.
The carrier?
Yep. Same way they're doing with the Zayo. I mean, if they want to put that out on Parkside Drive, they're going to have to replace the town's poles and pay for all that.
Yeah. Well, basically, the cell towers and whether they're towers or whatever, small cell facilities are put in by separate companies and then leased by the wireless carriers.
Yeah.
So that's basically basic business model. So,
Yeah, that's pretty common, yeah.
and then obviously, for the antenna to be effective, it's got to basically be line of sight coverage of the whole area that you are interested in covering.
My third question is, in existing subdivisions,
Yeah.
what? Am I going
That'll
to
be
end up,
interesting to see
am
how
I going to
that,
end up with a pole in my backyard?
well, that'll be interesting to see how that evolves, because that's going to be where it's going to be a concern, especially existing subdivisions where there's underground utilities, which would be more or less all the Farragut new, all the subdivisions since Farragut Incorporated have had underground utilities to my knowledge. And now the older ones that have overhead utilities, it would be a little bit less visible, of course. But yeah, these new ones where there's nothing other than maybe street lights, that's going to be.
Now, there's a lot of us that don't.
Town's
have
going to be
streetlights.
faced with probably a bunch of angry people but we will, on the other hand, we'll be in a position where we'll have to approve something that's not going to make people happy. But, I think we can certainly ask an applicant to try to do all that they can to make it as discreet as possible and in a location where there'd be minimal visibility of it. But I think that's going to be, if this 5G comes out and the technology doesn't change to where we do need a lot of these freestanding poles, I think it's going to be interesting how that occurs in these underground.
Larry
utility.
showed us pictures of them on the side of apartment buildings or something, or even inside
Yeah.
of some of these big office buildings. Is the antenna on the roof?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have one actually on Parkside Drive on the, the Verizon building. It's on top of their roof, but it's hidden behind the parapet, so you really don't see it. But they have a small cell like
When
that.
it's something like that, say the apartment complex goes in on Camel Station Road, we can
Yeah.
dream. Do they even have to come before us?
Well, that's
Can
one
they-
question we had in this ordinance, that his proposal is that, and he calls these a non-structure facility, because we weren't really sure what specifically he was talking about. He talks about these applications that are exempted, and he's talking about exempted from being reviewed by you all. And then he's also talks about a non-structure small cell system. And what he's talking about is what you're describing. It's either applications that are inside a building or on a building, or they're not a freestanding structure. They're incorporated into an existing structure. So they're non-structure small cells. Those are applications that probably will end up recommending that I would say the staff could review those unless there was a question, in which case we would have the ability to bring it before the Planning Commission, or the Board of Zoning Appeals, depending on how we want to treat that. I would prefer to try to have these matters dealing with telecommunications to come to the Planning Commission, because if we bring in a board that doesn't deal with something hardly ever, they have a lower lack of knowledge on it, and it's not their fault. They just don't deal with it a lot. So if we can bring these things to the Planning Commission, I think that's going to be helpful, because he does talk about use on reviews, which is in the town basically special exceptions, that if somebody is doing something that is questionable, that they could petition for a use on review. For example, if somebody wanted to install a tower that was more than 200 feet, that they could possibly do that, but it would be a special exception or a use on review. So, there are some things out there like that. But, yeah, I think what you're talking about are typically applications that the staff probably could review and approve because they wouldn't be noticeable to anybody. So more or less what we're talking about, I think, are the freestanding structures, those that are going to have a more visual impact to the public, to the community. Let's see, a couple other things I just wanted to run by you. Yes, I do think we need to amend the subdivision regulations in some fashion to try to provide for this kind of technology on the front end as part of utility installation and space for underground concealment structures. Let's see here. He did say 35 feet on the height would work, although higher would be better.
So higher better, but if it's 35 feet, there's going to be need for more of them.
Potentially. Yeah. Potentially they would
Or it
be.
depends on the area that's
One of the
coverage on it.
we asked him about co-location, and well, like for the tall towers, currently our ordinance requires them to be able to provide for at least 3 carriers, and that we could keep in there. Or he said we could also base this on the height of the tower. If you can have a 95-foot tall tower, but you can only have 1 carrier on it. Of course, they wouldn't want to have any more than 1 carrier because you couldn't get the kind of effect that you wanted on that short of a tower for any other providers. But you could require them to put that pole in such a manner that it would be able to accommodate an additional provider, and then if an additional provider came along, they could add 1 to it, but they would have to extend the height of the structure by 15, 20 feet. So you could make it based on that if you wanted to. What that would do is provide for shorter towers on the front end with the ability to make them taller as co-locators came in, up to maybe a maximum height. He said basically on the monopole towers, 95 feet's about as low as you'd want to go for it to be effective and for somebody to actually want to do it. So I don't know. I'm kind of I would kind of lean toward just keeping our current language, but I don't know how you all feel about that. If currently you can go up to 200 feet in our ordinance, but you have to provide for 3 providers. So I don't.
100 feet can handle 3, no more. Now, the one we have is what, 170?
160.
160.
Yeah, the newest one's 160, yeah.
And it has 1 provider right now.
I don't, does it just have 1? Yeah, just 1 right now. Yeah,
But 2 more could be added.
yeah, yep. What that does is, what he's talking about is just you're gonna have a shorter tower on the front end, but with the understanding that the height of it could, go up. The potential problem I see with that is we talked about this with that monopine application, is if you extend the height of it, how is that going to impact a stealth application? I don't know. I think you could run into some problems with that. It might be better just to go ahead and have a certain pole height, and maybe we ought to lower our pole height maximum. Maybe it shouldn't be more than 160. That's what they were able to do on Concord Road. I don't, unless somebody could demonstrate quantitatively a need for something higher than 160, which could be considered as some kind of a special exception review or something, that would be the maximum height. That would allow somebody to go ahead and put in that full stealth application like they did on Concord Road. So that may be what we ought to recommend, is just lowering the height, because they obviously were able to do it at 160, and they understood that they had to provide on that pole the ability to have at least 3 carriers. So that would lower our pole height by 40 feet from what you currently could go up to. How do y'all feel about that?
Good idea.
Yeah, I like 160 being the maximum.
Yeah, okay. I'm just concerned if you start messing with adjusting the height of the pole, you're going to create problems with the stealth application, which I think we ought to require on all new poles. I assume you all agree with that.
I noticed
And-
that we didn't include the monopine description in the stealth technology description. Is that something maybe we ought to add in there?
We can. Yep.
Because I'm happy with the final product over on Concord Road.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that's, I think we had some other things that we included in there, but for some reason the monopine or, something that looks like a tree was not in there. Let's see if we can include that in there.
Yep. Yeah, I think that turned out pretty good.
There's always a few trees much taller than everybody else.
He's got some language in here about applications you could consider up to 10 small cell structures per application, and I think that's more in a more urban area, so I think we could certainly lower that. I don't know if maybe we ought to have no more than 3. I mean, we had 3 come before us a few months ago, and I probably can't see a situation where in our town we would have more than 3 at any one time. I don't know, but 3 to 5 or something, but not 10. We felt like that was probably a little too much. Let's see here. He did feel like we could require on the small cell them to provide for the ability to have 2 co-locations. Though that technology is a little bit unclear as to how they would deal with the antenna and whether they could share that or not. So we could leave the language in there to require there to be at least the opportunity for 2 carriers. So like the poles that we're replacing on Parkside Drive, they need to set that up so that they could provide for at least another carrier. They got 2 carriers there. Thing is with that, if you're requiring the structures other than the antenna to be underground, we'll have to think about, especially in an existing situation, which is probably going to be the most common, whether we have enough physical space, for that to occur. And there may be a situation where an applicant could request some, again, he talks about a use on review in a situation where there just isn't the existing space due to other utilities or other things that might be impeding the ability to provide an additional underground vault for the structures. Our recommendation on the small cell, and if you all agree with it, is that all the new ones need to be underground. The pole, we can't do much about, but we would like to see them use some kind of technology. There's the 3M product that he talked about at the workshop, which is kind of a tape. It's a 5-layer tape that would go around the top of the pole. It basically is an antenna that's very discreet. This looks like a pole, basically. And that would be what we would want to see. We would recommend some type of antenna structure that's very concealed. So we don't want to obviously mention a particular manufacturer. We wouldn't do that, but there's 2 or 3 groups out there that deal with this type of technology. So I think
There's got to be some generic term for it.
Yeah, we'll come up with something that I'd just rather not have a bunch of those protruding antennas with wires and stuff. It just, it just could look really unsightly, especially if we have a lot of these things around.
On C9, where it says a 25 planted buffer strip.
Yeah.
If a pre-existing structure is being used for stealth purposes, the buffer strip planting may be waived. Does this limit us? Either they do it or they don't do it, but if they have plantings, but they need to be enhanced.
I think what that's referring to is if, for instance, there was a church steeple and they wanted to put the antenna inside the church steeple, well,
Would we see?
no, typically you
That's
wouldn't
right,
see it,
yeah.
and so there's no reason to buffer something because it's an existing church and there's a steeple there, and that was
Yeah.
just, I think, one of the
think you're right.
examples. There's probably some other examples within other tall buildings, but I think the one that he used and showed a photograph of was the church steeple.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's talking about non-structure applications. That was the main points that I wanted to mention. I guess what the plan is at this point is for the staff to take his comments and your input tonight and then finalize the draft. Still is going to be a draft, and then we'll probably send it out to some people that are in the industry that, kind of can give us some feedback if they wish to do so. And then we'll take that input, which could be 3 or 4 weeks, especially with the holidays, and I guess present a final version, and we'll bring it back to you all if that sounds like a plan. Because we definitely want to try to get this aspect of our zoning ordinance updated, because I think we're gonna see a lot of these small cells pretty soon. So.
But we also want to be sure we're legally right and aesthetically as well as we can come off too.
Yeah. There's a lot of things to consider. But, well, that's what we'll plan on doing then. if y'all have any other questions on this right now. Okay.
Move on to item number 8, discussion on a measure to help strengthen the implementation of an adopted architectural design standards.
Item is on the agenda for just discussion purposes. Some of the things in here you may not want to do anything about or whatever, but let me introduce it. You know, we adopted the design standards back in the spring of 2015, and they deal not only with a building's appearance, but also how you present a site. And we've had a number of site plans that have come before us since we've adopted those, and we've been kind of working through the document. It's kind of new to everybody. It's new to me. We've approved a number of text amendments to address, in particular, some site-related aspects of the design standards. And I think that the standards, you know, if you step back and look at where we were before we adopted the standards and the plans that have come before us, what they could have been without having these standards in place, I think they have been a tremendous success, in my opinion. We've gotten a lot better looking buildings. We've got